Welcome to TrustTalk. Today's guest is Reinhard Bachmann, Professor of International Management and the founder and director of the Center for Trust Research at SOAS University of London. He is one of the pioneers of trust research in the field of management theory. In his publications, he contributed to the development and design of trust research. He is a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Interorganizational Relationships and a member of the review board of the Journal of Trust Research. What role does trust play in interorganizational relationships, both vertical, like supply chains, and horizontal relationships, like all cooperative relationships between organizations? He talks about the role of power, about system or institutional trust, and the role of trust in merger and acquisition transactions, and why trust plays a major role in the failure of many M&A or joint venture deals. Trust isn't always positive. There are dark sides of trust, especially blind trust. Trust can suffocate innovation, taking away incentives to compete. Your host today, Severin DeWitt.
Professor Bachmann, welcome at TrustTalk. Before we go into trust and relationships between organizations, I would like to share a little story I told in my introductory podcast about trust when I started in 2020. A major conference was organized to discuss all aspects of trust. A proper agenda was made. People were ready to discuss trust in all its appearances. And then the conference chairman suggested to first get everyone to agree on what trust is. And I guess you feel what happened. The only thing that was debated during the whole day was the definition of trust. So this reminds me of what Oliver Williamson, the 2009 joint winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, said about trust. And I'm quoting him, "Trust is a common word, but without a common meaning."
Yes, I think this is right. There's actually limited consensus about what trust is, although I would say there are some common themes which run through all the definitions that I know on trust. A big difference makes the angle, the disciplinary angle from which you look at the phenomenon. So what I mean is a political scientist would define it in a way different from what an economist would say, or a sociologist or a psychologist. So you see, the problem of trust is that there are so many disciplines which are interested in the phenomenon. Traditionally, it was seen as a psychological phenomenon, especially if we look at interpersonal relationships, but in the management field, of course, there are many more dimensions than just the psychological dimension. So what counts is the context in which trusters make their decisions, and a lot more factors come into the equation. It's not like in the early days when psychologists made some experimental research on trust. It is a huge field, meanwhile, where a lot of disciplines contribute and present studies and so forth. So this is something which makes it so difficult to get a handle on it. And on the other hand, it's also common with many things in the social sciences where you need to understand the scholarly terminology. So it is a difference, of course, from the ordinary language when we use trust. So there's a lot of theory behind it, there's a lot of empirical findings, and that all contribute to some common ground. Again, I think there is some common ground there.
Yeah, we'll probably come to that later when we're talking about some of the elements of trust, right? Because in your handbook of trust research, that's edited by yourself and Akbar Zahir, trust is described as follows. Trust involves two principal concepts, reliance and risk.
Yes, I think risk, or sometimes also we speak of uncertainty, is of course a key concept and category here. A truster always needs to run a certain risk, namely that his or her expectations can be disappointed, and consequentially there can be some significant losses if a truster has misplaced his trust. A truster needs to be vulnerable, because if you're not vulnerable, then the whole concept of trust doesn't make any sense. You don't need to trust if you're not vulnerable. You don't need to trust if you want to avoid any kind of risk. And another point, of course, is that a truster always makes positive assumptions about the future behavior of the trustee. So I think these are common themes that run through all kinds of definitions of trust. Also, we work on the basis of limited knowledge. So if you know everything, you don't need to trust. If you know nothing, then it's also stupid to trust. So you're operating in a field where there's limited knowledge. So that is also goes back to the earliest definitions of trust, which we have. I think this is common sense, irrespective of what discipline you belong to.
What I miss in the definition we just talked about, or people talk about, are the factors that I think your colleague, Professor Sandra Suscher, mentioned in the interview I had with her in February of this year. That is competence, both technical and managerial, motives, means, and impacts. She used the example of Uber to clarify what she meant by those factors. What would be your take on those elements? Competence, motives, means, and impact.
Let's take the first one, competence. There is also well-established literature and scholarly knowledge on different dimensions of trust and what can trigger trust, but also, on the other hand, what can ruin trust. And here we come to issues such as competence, but also integrity, which is a big difference. So you can trust someone on the basis of competence. You trust someone that he or she is competent enough to fulfill a certain promise, or you focus on integrity. So someone can completely fulfill your criterion of integrity, but is incompetent. So if that's the case, then it's a different situation with regard to trust than if that is the other way around. Someone can be very competent, but basically a crook and not trustworthy. And there are other people who would also add a third dimension, which is benevolence. So this is well established. The main difference here is really competence versus integrity. But when it comes to the other factors, motives, means, and impact, I think these are all factors that show that trust is normally occurring in a certain social situation. So it's situated and embedded in an environment, and their motives of trusters come into the picture. What are the means that you have as a trustee in case you are put under pressure by the truster, which is also possible. So it's not only a very positive thing. So trust can also put you in a situation where you feel obligations which you're not comfortable with. And also the impact, of course, is another factor which shows that the environment in which such situations where trust plays a role are situated, these environments are most crucial. So it's not only the trustor and the trustee as two people, is also a third sphere which is very important with regard to how trusters make their decisions, and that is the institutional cultural environment. And here we talk about motives, means, and impact, I think.
Let's talk about the trust within and between organizations. That's the core of your expertise, right? Is it fair to say that research in that area is to produce insights into why organizations enter into relationships with one another, and what role plays trust in that process?
Yes, I think this is absolutely correct. I mean, when we talk about interorganizational relationships, there are two different types of interorganizational relationships. One is vertical relationships, so these are supply chains, and then there are horizontal relationships in all kinds of cooperative relationships between organizations, if they are business organizations, in a similar stage of the value creation chain of a certain industry. So we have vertical, basically supply relationships, and horizontal relationships. Especially when it comes to vertical relationships, in which context I discovered the role of trust really in the 1990s when I was a postdoc at the University of Cambridge. I was involved in a study on vertical relationships, It is interesting to see also the dialectics between trust and power. In a vertical relationship, there's usually also a very powerful part. This is why I always included in many of my contributions and writings the category of power and try to figure out what the relationship between trust and power can be in interorganizational relationships.
So, taking that a little bit further, what is the relationship between power and trust in the vertical column, as you describe it?
It is very much dependent on the business system. If we talk about business organizations, what we found, and that's many years ago, as I said, in 1990s, but that is still debated and there's still a lot of empirical attention. The political economy literature differentiates between different types of capitalism. So there's the more liberal capitalism, which we have in the UK, and there's the more coordinated capitalism. And a coordinated capitalist system would mean that there are a lot of general rules to follow as a business organization, for example. And that would put you in a situation where individual power is not necessarily key to success in your business. So it is more a form of power which is cushioned into a tight legal system, a tight system of institutional arrangements. And there we speak of system power, and we have a form of trust, which has sometimes also been called system trust by Luhmann or institutional trust by others. And if you come to the more liberal capitalist systems, then there's a lot less general regulation. So that means that you have to develop trust more at the interpersonal level. And also power is more a thing which is attached to the potential of a single individual rather than that it can be attributed to the system. So surprisingly different, even though geographically we are so close, the UK and continental Europe, but it also has to do with different legal traditions, like there's common law and there's civil law. And we have common law in the UK and civil law in Europe. And common law means that there are very few general rules to follow as a business person or business organization. And therefore, it much more depends on the individual competence or guile or whatever you have in order to get your interests represented in contracts and in the relationship as a whole.
One of the things that helps listeners to understand these rather abstract research findings is to give real-time examples of failed or successful trusted relationships between organizations. Would you be able to give an example?
Yes, when we look at business organizations, then we have a wide field of mergers and acquisitions, for example, where you need to integrate two organizations. And especially in the case of acquisitions rather than mergers, we don't have equal partners. So if you happen to be in the management or in the workforce of a smaller acquired organization, business organization, it is not uncommon that you distrust the other side because it could cost your job. It will certainly involve changes which you can't foresee and you may not want to accommodate. So that is a wide field, and there are examples of acquisitions which went well and others not so well. Surprisingly, a majority of acquisitions does not work very well. And one of the things is that there's a lack of trust from both sides and there are misunderstandings. There's a problem of integrating different corporate cultures, for example. So this has caused a lot of problems in many cases, empirical cases. But then there are also strategic alliances and joint ventures, where there's extended literature on it. Joint ventures, the same problem in principle, but this is where two organizations, business organizations, come together just for one specific project. So they're not completely merging, only a part of their business for a certain period of time. But the problem in terms of trust is the same. It depends on whether the joint venture is equity-based, where you put in money and can lose money, then it makes it even more complicated sometimes. Another example, if you think back to what they called the global financial crisis, was actually not a global financial crisis, but it was a Western financial crisis in 2008, where banks didn't trust each other anymore after the collapse of Lehman Brothers in 2008. So that can create a lot of disruption. And there's really extended literature with a lot of examples what happens in the case of failed trust or ruined trust. There's a lot of literature on scandals which has ruined trust between organizations, but also between customers and organizations. And that's part of the trust literature where we look into all kinds of industries and all kinds of interorganizational relationships. So there's plenty of examples there.
Follow up on what you just said. There seems to be a distinction in your publications between personal trust and organizational trust. It sounds easy to understand. Trust between two persons whereby the agent is doing something for the principal, as it is sometimes described in scholarly literature, which is different from trust between organizations. Is it as easy?
No, this is much more complicated when you look into the details and study empirical cases. First of all, when we talk about organizational trust and we think about trust in an organization, then it seems to be essential that sometimes you need to see, as Anthony Giddens has said in one of his famous writings on modernity and trust, into the whites of eyes of people. So you have to have access points to the organizations, and that needs to be persons. Sometimes you have to see real persons who represent the organization. So if it's just an abstract organization and you would not associate any human face with it, it would be very difficult to trust it for many people. So that's one thing. So you need access points, you need representatives for the organization, and these needs to be persons, which then you take as representatives in the sense that you bestow trust on the whole organization that this person represents. On the other hand, when we talk about impersonal trust, I think it has two meanings. And again, empirical cases can illustrate this very nicely. So either it means that you, in the end, have trust in an organization. So you trust a big company like Shell or BP or Volkswagen, whatever. Another thing is that you can have trust to another person or trust in another person in the face of a specific organizational structure. So that would bring in these external factors, this environment, which can help to increase or facilitate trust between individuals. So you see, the difference is either you trust directly in an organization or you trust someone else, and knowing that this person is embedded in certain organizational structures and limits or channels his or her behavior in a certain way, and thus makes it more predictable.
We see trust always as a good thing, sometimes has something to strive for and to maintain. There have been numerous studies showing that trust is not always desirable. For many, this may come as a surprise. Does it also come to you as a surprise?
No, there is indeed quite a bit of literature on the dark sides of trust. Trust is certainly can suffocate innovation, especially if we talk about blind trust. So it takes away incentives, individual incentives to innovate, to compete with others. If you're on a network which is strongly based on trust, and you have, for instance, a supplier over many decades, you're happy with the supplier, you're not trying to find new suppliers, which would entail transaction costs. But on the whole, it can also lead to situations where you miss out on chances, innovation chances, or chances to put yourself in a better situation vis-a-vis your competitors. And also look at the financial crisis of 2008, which was so disruptive to the Western economies. There was a trust crisis among banks and also banks and customers after the failure of the system. But before, it was hugely fueled by too much trust, I would say. Remember these situations, I don't know whether you had the same experience that I had, but a lot of people got approached by financial advisors, and you were very happy to believe that you can make huge profits, and you trusted financial advisors and gave them loads and loads of money. There was clearly too much trust. If there hadn't been that much trust by many financial services customers, I wonder whether the financial crisis would have ever happened. So there's also more literature now about distrust more recently, which can be also very useful in many situations, because at the end of the day, what trust does, I think, is, in words of Niklas Luhmann, to reduce uncertainty, and in this sense, also in the systems theoretical terminology, reduces complexity. And what this means is that you can connect your interactions with other people in a swift and effective way. But you can also do this with distrust. On the basis of distrust, you can also very quickly interlink, align your assumptions in a social situation and get in a situation where you can effectively interact. And that's really what I think is the core of trust, namely a means to coordinate expectations and interaction. There are other means to do this as well. And distrust is sometimes, as well as power, discussed in the same way. These can be functional equivalents in the sense that they can reduce uncertainty and allow people to align their expectations and effectively interlink their actions, and thus create huge, complex, in a positive sense, complex social systems, which we all know.
Most of my interviews, Professor Bachmann, ends with a question I would also like to ask you, and that is, how do you see the future of trust results? What are the challenges ahead the coming years?
I think what has changed compared to the 1990s, when this interest in trust in the management field started and afterwards really exploded, is that we have a lot more surveillance technology available today. So there would be a lot of organizations that would today say we don't need trust because we can control our operations much more closely by technical means than we would have done in the past. My employer could monitor all my work that I do at home. Every strike on my laptop, they know. And there are many, many examples where organizations could say, look, I'm not dependent on trust. I'm not dependent that you work according to the contract which you have signed. Working from home has become very important during the recent pandemic. And so there are a lot of organizations that would say control is actually possible and is the better way to do it. And you can look into every lecture theater. If you are the dean of a university, you can check everything basically. If you go to a hospital, they make videos of your operations, you can check it. And so all this was not possible in the mid-1990s. So it could lead to the question of, is trust becoming obsolete? My answer would be no, not at all. Because what we need is, if we control everything very tightly in the work process, in families, and in all kinds of social situations, what we would lose is creativity. So if my employer would control me, I don't think I would be very creative in my research work. And that goes for many other fields and organizations as well. So I think that would be a very bad advice to an organization, to revert to a situation where trust didn't play a role. So that was in the early days when they invented assembly lines, and Taylorism was meant to work completely without trust. But only in the 1980s, there were new production concepts discussed, and there was the example of the car industry in Japan, where workers were involved in all kinds of quality circles and so forth. So where they essentially got rid of these rigid assembly lines and showed that they were much more productive. So that was in the 1980s, where trust was not on the agenda yet, but you could almost foresee that it would lead to this extreme interest in trust in the 1990s. And if we are now reverting to the system which we had about 100 years ago, which was described in the literature as Fordism and Taylorism, the assembly lines, where every minute of your work was completely regulated, then of course we don't need trust anymore, but it would also decrease productivity. I think creativity and goodwill is always a part of a superior performance.
Let's hope that we don't lose that, because that's the oxygen of our existence, isn't it? Professor Bachmann, thank you very much for being available today for the podcast. Thank you for your insights. I wish you good luck with the future research, and got me also some ideas to focus on next podcasts. For example, trust and power, I noted that, and trust in the financial world. These are interesting subjects. Thank you very much, and wish you all the best.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Trust Talk. We would be very grateful if you would leave us a review on Apple Podcasts. Don't miss out on future travels around trust, and subscribe to this channel or visit us on our website, trusttalk.co, or on Twitter @trusttalkco. We look forward to seeing you again.